On this Thursday night, a new investment in electric batteries.
This is a historic and transformative announcement.
Billions in public money lured a Swedish battery maker to Quebec. Will the gamble pay off?
It has never made batteries at large scale.
Seeking justice for Joyce Eschequans.
I felt like I was watching a murder.
What's changed 3 years after her story highlighted racism in a Quebec hospital? Back to masks, BC hospitals brace for a season of sickness.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Thanks to another injection of billions in public money, a Swedish company that makes batteries for electric vehicles has chosen to build its new plant in Canada. Northvolt is being promised $2.7 billion in subsidies from the Canadian and Quebec governments. It's part of a concerted effort to lure companies to Canada by matching incentives offered by the United States. Stellantis and Volkswagen have already been promised about $30 billion to build EV battery plants in Ontario. There are questions about where the costly subsidy arms race is headed. Tim Sargeant has our top story tonight.
It's the kind of deal that gets federal and provincial political leaders all revved up. A $7 billion investment to build a massive battery-making plant for electric vehicles.
This is a historic and transformative announcement.
But at Northvolt, we don't stand still. So we're bringing our ambitions to Canada.
The Swedish company Northvolt hopes to start building its gigafactory for lithium-ion batteries just outside of Montreal. It's the largest single private investment ever made in Quebec, but there's a lot of public financing behind the deal. Subsidies in the forms of loans and grants from the federal and Quebec governments could reach as much as $4.6 billion.
What is important is that we're building an industry.
The future plant will be constructed on a footprint of 170 hectares, the equivalent of more than 300 football fields. Northvolt chose Quebec after first looking at almost all 50 states south of the border. At full capacity, Northvolt is hoping to produce enough batteries to power up to 1 million electric vehicles a year. But critics warn reaching that goal won't be easy. Northvolt has been in this business less than 1 decade, and there's a lot of competition from more experienced electric battery makers.
Northvolt has only barely begun to make batteries. It has never made batteries at large scale, and this is the very largest scale.
Lawmakers and others pushing for a greener economy insist now is the time to make these investments. Groundbreaking is scheduled to begin by early next year, with the first batteries coming out of the plant in 2026. Northvolt says the entire factory should be in full production by 2028. Tim Sargeant, Global News, Montreal.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with his Indian counterpart in Washington today. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's sure Blinken would bring up what he calls Canada's credible allegation that Indian agents were behind the killing of a Canadian Sikh leader. Touria Izri reports.
America's top diplomat is hosting his Indian counterpart.
It's a pleasure to welcome my friend and colleague.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met India's Minister of External Affairs at the State Department.
We thank the U.S. for all the support at the G20 summit.
But it's Canada that's hanging over their meeting.
Is the second is Canada impacting your relationship?
While they were quiet in front of the cameras, there are concerns being expressed behind the scenes. 3 sources told Global News Canada's allies were shocked by the decision to go public and are deeply concerned about how it will affect the relationship with India. Last week, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revealed Canada has credible intelligence Indian agents may be linked to the killing of Sikh leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Trudeau says he's certain Blinken raised the issue with the Indian External Affairs Minister.
Yes, the Americans have been with us in speaking to the Indian government about how important it is that they be involved in following up on the credible allegations.
The White House would not comment.
What I will say, however, is that we have consistently engaged with the Indian government on this question and have urged them to cooperate.
Despite the close relationship between the U.S. and Canada, this South Asia expert believes it has limits.
I think it's a tough spot that the U.S. is in that it needs to balance its close alliance with Canada with its strategic partnership with India.
Boosting that partnership is a major U.S. foreign policy goal, as Washington courts India as a counterweight to China.
The U.S. will draw the line because of who the target of this allegation is. This is not a rogue state.
Since the allegations emerged, Canada's allies have appeared muted in their response, as Western countries weigh their own interests and whether it's worth it to pick a fight with India. Touria Izri, Global News, Ottawa.
An Indigenous woman who live-streamed her final hours in a Quebec hospital, documenting how she was ignored by staff and insulted with racist taunts, is being honored tonight. What happened to Joyce Eschequans caused outrage. 3 years later, her family and community are still working to ensure what happened to her is never repeated. Here's Mike Armstrong.
There are days you never forget, and for the Lanaudière Native Friendship Centre, this is one. Joyce Eschequans' video was first seen by her friends on Facebook, but then spread quickly.
The first time I saw the video, I felt like I was watching a crime. And my first reaction was to call the police. It's the first thing I did after I saw the video was to call the police because I felt like I was watching a murder.
They are images that are painful to watch. It's not just that Joyce Eschequans is writhing in agony, it's also how she's treated. When she was admitted, a nurse identified Eschequans on her chart as a drug abuser in withdrawal. She wasn't. Eschequans had gone to hospital with stomach pains and would die 2 days later of a buildup of fluid in her lungs. That would happen after staff insulted her in the video, laughing and telling her she was better off dead and only good for sex. The coroner who investigated the case was asked if Eschequans would have been treated differently and survived if she had been white. She said yes, and that racism and prejudices led to her death. There will be a march outside the hospital where Eschequans died to commemorate this day, but also to recognize a legacy. Eschequans' video gave Indigenous peoples, and women in particular, something to point to. Because in the past, too often, if they complained about how they were treated, they weren't believed.
With this video, it was something that was concrete, that can say that you're not alone and that you weren't just imagining it.
Distrust in the healthcare system has an impact on health. Indigenous people are less likely to go to hospital if they're sick, and that often compounds problems.
That leads to a situation where you can have 15 years difference of life expectancy between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people.
Now, he's usually there, but Eschequans' husband isn't attending the vigils in her memory this year. A family member says instead he's chosen on this day to remember privately with his children. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Joliette, Quebec.
A judge in Saskatchewan has granted an interim injunction to stop a government policy about pronoun use at school. The decision pauses the requirement for parental consent when children under the age of 16 want to use different names and pronouns. Lawyers argued the policy violates the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and could lead teachers to out or misgender children at school. The province's lawyers say the policy has been misinterpreted. Premier Scott Moe is recalling the legislature to pass legislation protecting parents' rights. Health Canada has approved an updated COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer. The one-dose vaccine targets a subvariant of Omicron and is authorized for use in people 6 months of age and older, regardless of their COVID-19 vaccination history. As winter approaches, British Columbia's government is bringing back mandatory mask wearing in healthcare settings.
But starting next week on October 3rd, we're going to be putting back in some of the measures to make sure that we're doing our best to protect people who are most vulnerable in those settings.
Healthcare workers, visitors, and volunteers will be required to wear masks in patient and resident care areas. Visitors to long-term care homes will also be required to mask in common areas. The province says people will be stationed at healthcare entrances to screen for symptoms of respiratory illnesses. In the Netherlands, 3 people have died after a lone gunman opened fire inside a Rotterdam apartment and a university hospital. A 32-year-old suspect has been arrested. Police say he was a student at the same medical university. The gunman shot and killed a 39-year-old woman and seriously injured her 14-year-old daughter, who later died. The suspect then went to the teaching hospital and fatally shot a 46-year-old teacher. In the U.S., the first public hearing got underway in the Republicans' impeachment inquiry of President Joe Biden. Republicans say their inquiry is focused on whether Biden was involved in or benefited from his family's foreign business dealings, including those of his son Hunter Biden. The White House calls it extreme politics at its worst. Brittany Rosen explains what this is all about.
For years, President Biden has lied to the American people about
the accusations center around Biden's alleged ties to his son's foreign business dealings in Ukraine and China during his time as vice president.
The Bidens and their associates created over 20 shell companies, most of which were created when Joe Biden was vice president, and raked in over $20 million. Now, what were the Bidens selling to make all this money? Joe Biden himself.
Republicans say they've uncovered an overwhelming amount of evidence showing the president abused his public office for financial gain. But Democrats aren't convinced.
If the Republicans had a smoking gun or even a dripping water pistol, they would be presenting it today, but they've got nothing on Joe Biden.
Do you all solemnly swear?
The committee heard from multiple witnesses, most of whom were picked by Republican representatives. None of them has firsthand knowledge of Hunter Biden's business deals.
I do not believe that the current evidence would support articles of impeachment.
There were executives who asked Hunter Biden for help. Again, not yet any proof about any kind of complicity of President Biden.
The committee will determine if there are sufficient grounds for the full House to consider an impeachment. Thursday's hearing comes less than 70 hours before a likely government shutdown.
We are reaching the point where it's going to be really hard for the House and the Senate to act on a piece of legislation keeping the government open.
President Biden spent most of the day in Arizona, notably giving a speech on the state of democracy. The White House is calling this a political stunt, slamming the committee for holding impeachment hearings as opposed to putting forth efforts to avert a government shutdown. Donna?
All right, Brittany Rosen in Washington, thanks. Tens of thousands fleeing their homes. Coming up, the refugee crisis in Azerbaijan as a deadly territorial dispute reaches a climax. There's a major development in the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh. The region's breakaway government has announced it will dissolve itself and the republic will cease to exist. The territory is internationally recognized as being part of Azerbaijan, but has been run by ethnic Armenians for decades. Azerbaijan launched a major military offensive last week to reclaim full control. It's believed more than half the population of 120,000 have fled. Canada is providing $2.5 million in humanitarian aid. Crystal Gamansing reports.
They escaped the fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, but not the fear. From the very first moments of the war, we stayed in the basement of our neighbor for several hours. The mother of 4 says her children were crying and she was scared. In the past week, there's been a steady stream of people leaving the region. More than 70,000 ethnic Armenians are said to have fled.
Of course, I am going to leave because this place is too small for both of us. If they are here, we have to leave.
This ethnic Armenian journalist is documenting the fighting. Her videos show cars and buildings riddled with bullet holes and families in hiding. Global News has not been able to verify the date or the location of the images. The World Health Organization says a third of the population of the region has fled. Many have little to nothing with them.
I think right now, given the cold temperatures at night, emergency shelter is absolutely crucial.
The Prime Minister of Armenia accused Azerbaijan of ethnic cleansing in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, an allegation Azerbaijan's foreign minister said we strongly condemn and reject, adding, we call on Armenians not to leave their places of residence and to be a part of the multi-ethnic Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan arrested the former head of Nagorno-Karabakh's separatist government. It followed what Azerbaijan called an anti-terrorism military operation last week in an effort to seize control from the breakaway government. Armenia had called on countries, including Russia, to help. Russian peacekeepers have been deployed in the region since 2020. Now fighting its own war in Ukraine, Russia was accused of not answering the call. Without help, Armenian forces surrendered their weapons and control. The growing humanitarian crisis, caring for all the people needing food, water, and shelter, is now of greatest importance. Crystal Gamansing, Global News, London.
Trading in shares of the Chinese real estate giant Evergrande have been suspended after reports its billionaire chairman is under police investigation. Bloomberg was first to report Evergrande founder Hui Kai-yan, once one of China's richest men, is being monitored by Chinese police after he was taken away earlier this month. It remains unclear what crimes he's suspected of committing. Chinese media also report several current and former executives have been detained. The real estate development company is thought to have close to $300 billion in debt. Its stock has fallen more than 80% since August, when it resumed trading after a previous 17-month suspension. The company defaulted in 2021, and many financial experts say that triggered China's real estate crisis. Still ahead, what we can do to reduce the impact of wildfires in Canada. Canada has never had as many wildfires as this year. Natural Resources Canada says more than 220 of them are still out of control, most of them in Western Canada. Winter will give fire crews a breather, but the focus now is finding ways to avoid another record-breaking year. Neetu Garcha reports on how the way we fight and manage fires is evolving.
I just want to do a quick touch base. We've had a lot of movement, a lot of transition the last couple of days.
It's the start of another busy day for the crew on the Rossmore Lake wildfire.
I know some people are new to the fire, but if you've been on the fire, you know that this area that we're in, we get a lot of variable winds.
Global News was granted rare access to BC wildfire crews at the end of July. On this day, they were carefully planning and executing planned ignitions to burn up excess forest fuels.
What I want to do is I want to remove all the surface fuels, because that's how fire starts to spread. If I take that out of the equation, I can walk away from here being very confident that my fire will not wrap around me.
Canada is in the midst of the worst wildfire season it's ever faced, with close to 18 million hectares engulfed nationwide. And with climate change, fire seasons will continue to accelerate. That's why fire ecologists like Robert Gray say we need to reimagine how we think about fire.
We need to be doing much more prescribed burning. Strategically doing it around communities is a really important place to be doing it. People, they hear us say that and they what do you mean you're burning next to communities?
Prescribed burns are similar to planned ignitions. When managed properly, it can reduce dangerous fuel sources, create healthy forests, and boost animal habitat.
The other thing fire does is it releases all the nutrients that are stored in the dead material.
Experts want this approach to be significantly expanded, especially since these burns can act like fences to fire movement.
If you have a lot of fences on the landscape, and even if you're just slowing down fires, it buys time for the weather to change. It buys time for suppression resources to get there. And eventually you'll start to see fire size shrink.
That is very much the hope of those on the front lines.
These wildfires aren't just affecting our forests, they're affecting families and communities. It's just becoming a part of our lives here in British Columbia and really across the world.
Also, in our report on the new reality, we learn about Indigenous fire stewardship and how cultural burning using controlled fire can benefit biodiversity and reduce the risk of wildfires.
Thanks, Neetu. And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Air Canada is Toronto, which happens to be where the winning ticket for last night's record-breaking $68 million Lotto 649 jackpot was sold. They're still waiting for the winner to come forward, so just a bit of advice, check your tickets. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.